Imam Hassan bin Ali, Lord of Paradise, by Fawzi al-Saif, translated by Ali Salah, and voiced by Tahir bin Sheikh. Imam Hassan, from birth to martyrdom. The birth of Al-Hassan, the grandson of the Holy Prophet. Fatima Zahrat's marriage to Amir al-Mu'mineen was in Dhul Hijjah, 2 years after the Holy Prophet migrated to Medina. On the 15th of Ramadan, the following year, 3 Hijri, the first child was born in the blessed Alawi Fatimi house. There is a debate on whether it was Imam Hassan who was born after only 6 months of pregnancy, or if it was his brother, Imam Hussein. The second possibility is supported by some narrations, saying that between the 2 brothers was 6 months and a single cycle. Other narrations mention similarities between Imam Hussein and the Prophet Yahya, the son of Zakaria. One of these similarities, in addition to their martyrdom and being killed by the tyrant of their times, was that they were both born after a 6-month pregnancy. However, these are contradicted by the fact that Imam Hussein was born, according to the most likely possibility, on the 3rd of Sha'ban, in the 4th year Hijri. If the time between Imam Hassan's birth and Imam Hussein's conception in the womb was only 1 cycle, it is not possible for Imam Hussein's birth to be in Sha'ban. This is because if we assume Imam Hassan was born in the middle of Ramadan, and that a single cycle, at least 10 days, passed after that, that would mean Imam Hussein's conception must have happened at the end of Ramadan. And if we are saying that Fatima's pregnancy with him was the minimum length, so 6 months, just like the narration compared the Prophet Yahya with, that would mean Imam Hussein's birth must have occurred in Rabi' al-Awwal, 6 months later. But the most accepted date by historians is the 3rd of Sha'ban. So that would mean either the date of birth is inaccurate, or that 6 months was, in fact, not the length of pregnancy, or that more than 1 cycle had passed before his conception. Another possibility is that Imam Hassan was not actually born on the 15th of Ramadan. Whichever it is, one of these facts must be discarded. There is another possibility accepted by some scholars, which is that the 6-month pregnancy was that of Imam Hassan, not of Imam Hussein, and that the confusion was caused by the similarity between the 2 names in the written documents. It is said that when Imam Hassan was born, he was wrapped in a yellow cloth and brought to the Holy Prophet to perform the mustahab rituals, including reciting the adhan in his right ear and the iqama in his left ear, and cleansing him of his spittle, Zamzam water, or with some dates. But when the Holy Prophet saw him in a yellow cloth, he quickly removed it, and in some narrations he forbade from wrapping a newborn in anything other than a white cloth. Research suggests that white is the best color for newborns because of the way it helps to distinguish other colors. It is similar to the way photographers and videographers hold a white paper in front of the camera lens, calibrating the camera so that when they remove the paper, it can distinguish colors more naturally. This may have been an indication to the effect colors have on physical and mental health, especially those of an infant. So did the Holy Prophet switch the yellow cloth for a white one for either reason, or maybe both, or maybe it was a devotional reason we are told to do that we simply do not comprehend. However, we normally try to not lay things onto the devotional side, as we sometimes find mustahab and makruh actions that we can guess the reasons behind. For example, when reciting the adhan and iqama in a newborn's ears, we are instilling important principles into the child through reciting a summary of religion into either ear, making that the first memory stored into the child's mind, which will undoubtedly have its effect on the life that lies ahead. It certainly has a different effect than if a child's ears and memory is filled with music and commotion from the first instance of its life. We should also point out certain manners that must be followed when choosing a name for the newborn. We find some families turning it into a large dispute, where the mother wants to be the one to choose the name because of the suffering she went through during pregnancy, while the father wants to pick because the child will be carrying his name, all of which turns a happy occasion into a fight. Meanwhile, we find Amir al-Mu'mineen telling the Holy Prophet that he would not precede him in choosing the name for his son. The narrations tell us that it is mustahab to choose an adequate and respectable name for a newborn, rather than choosing a name based on what the father or mother likes. Causing the poor child misery and pain for its entire life, as he is unable to change it, nor accept it. A note on the name of Harun's son. There is a number of narrations that compare Imam Ali to Prophet Harun and his sons to the sons of Harun, and the denial of his leadership to that of Harun. The intention of these narrations was to give the Muslims a comparison to something they are all familiar with, as they have all read the Quran and all know the status of Prophet Harun, and all know the status Prophet Harun had to Prophet Musa. These narrations also mention that it is mustahab to give aqiqah, sacrificing an animal for the newborn, and to give charity for him, and also that it is makruh to do what they used to do before Islam, where they would cover the newborn in blood. The Holy Prophet's narrations on Al-Hassan. Imam Hassan grew up under the care of the Holy Prophet, and his counseling with his guidance, and Ali al-Murtada and Fatima Zahra's custody. Could you imagine what the product would be? We notice something that may seem uninteresting for its obviousness and recurrence, but it must be touched upon every time it is observed. We see that the Holy Prophet has so many narrations about Imam Hassan and Imam Hussein, tens of which are in Sunni books, and dozens of times more than that in our books. Now, what is interesting is that Imam Hassan and Imam Hussein were 3, 4, or 5 years of age at best. This is considering the fact that, when his grandfather passed away, Imam Hassan was 7 years old. So what is the reason behind all these narrations, and why proclaim them in front of the people? We will go over some of these narrations in the following pages, pointing out some of the deep and hidden meanings, but we will say here that which we have said in another place. The purpose behind narrations stating the attributes of some personalities was to show the true path that must be followed by the nation after the passing of the Holy Prophet. It was completely natural for the nation to become fragmented after his passing, which is what happened, and for every faction to claim that they are more worthy of inheriting the Holy Prophet's status. The majority, being the companions of the Holy Prophet, found that they need to solidify their position as the Prophet's successor in knowledge, profile, and method. Here came the role of the trait narrations, where they made up narrations that contradict what has been correctly verified to have been said by the Holy Prophet. The deceptive frauds suddenly became the righteous leaders, and those leading to hellfire became propagators to the truth. But naturally, the words of the Holy Prophet never contradict. When we observe the Holy Prophet's narrations about the traits of Imam Hassan, we see a clear guide to survival in times of disarray and dispute, and that is what the nation should have been following. He is the Lord of the youth of paradise, and therefore all those who stand against him cannot possibly be on the path of paradise. And when we are told that he has the best grandfather, grandmother, father, mother, uncle, and aunt, and that he, the aforementioned, and all those who love him are in paradise, that means people should gather around his banner and march behind him, When the Holy Prophet would call for his grandson, Al-Hassan, and later his brother, Al-Hussein too, by saying, "Call for my sons," saying it repeatedly and on many occasions, one can sense that there is an unspoken warning, a warning that they will be oppressed and rejected by a large faction of the nation, who will try with all their might to deny the kinship of Al-Hassan and Al-Hussein to the Holy Prophet, claiming that our sons are the sons of our sons, but our daughters, their sons, are the sons of unrelated men. By doing so, they have turned down the clear statement of the Holy Quran, where it says, "Say, come, let us call our sons and your sons." When the Holy Prophet brought nobody but Imam Hassan and Imam Hussein, hence, they have rejected the words of Allah Almighty and the words of the Holy Prophet, and for what? The words of a poet, to be followed only by his perverse equals. And though those earlier in history stood against the Imams, blindly following the sons of Al-Umayyah and the sons of Abbas with no tangible proof or divine backing, they did that in greed of power and wealth. But what is the matter with the miserable beings in the present times, defending an ideology and belief which has been thoroughly exposed as false? You see them constantly moving from one argument to another, vigorously trying to deny Imam Hassan and Imam Hussein's blood relation with their grandfather, the Holy Prophet. We see extensive efforts to manipulate narrations that clearly speak of the imamate and leadership of Al-Hassan and Al-Hussein, trying to dismiss them as emotional and inconsequential. We see them discounting narrations like those saying they are imams, whether they are standing or sitting, to the extent of denying them completely or dismissing them as unreliable. Meanwhile, we find them highlighting narrations talking about how they urinated on the Holy Prophet's clothes and such. We see clear implications in our narrations, such as the Holy Prophet carried Al-Hassan and Al-Hussein on his back. Al-Hassan was on his right ribs and Al-Hussein was on his left. He walked and then said, "Your ride is the best ride, and you are the best rider, and your father is even better than you." Or what Salman narrated, the Holy Prophet said about Al-Hassan and Al-Hussein, "I love whoever loves them, and whoever I love, Allah Almighty loves, and whoever Allah Almighty loves, He grants paradise, and I loathe those who loathe them and defy them, and whoever I loathe, Allah Almighty loathes, and whoever Allah Almighty loathes, He punishes them with hellfire, and they suffer endless agony." Was the Holy Prophet perhaps talking of a time in which the hatred of Ahl al-Bayt will be a prevalent theme? Something that catches the attention of scholars in the way the Holy Prophet treated Imam Hassan and Imam Hussein is how he treated them like fully grown adults, disregarding age completely, which was a huge factor, especially in Arab society back then. On many occasions in those times, a person will be favored for nothing but their age, and yet we find the Holy Prophet bringing them with him to Mubahala, the first ever and most important debate between Muslims and Christians in history. He acknowledges their witnessing of the treaty between Banu Thaqif and himself, even though he could have, theoretically, involved tens of other older companions as witnesses instead. According to historians, this is the letter of the Holy Prophet to Thaqif. He writes that they have the oath of Allah, besides whom there is no God, and the oath of Muhammad bin Abdullah, the Prophet, on what is the document that their valley is safe, fully under the protection of Allah Almighty, and witness to this manuscript of the treaty is Ali bin Ali Talib, Al-Hassan bin Ali, and Al-Hussein bin Ali. This manuscript has been written as testimony. Is this a forewarning to a time in which Al-Hassan and his brother will ascend the pulpit of their father and grandfather and stand up to the illegitimate caliph of their time? Is he trying to tell us that the testimony of Imam Hassan, which was accepted by the Holy Prophet, should be unconditionally accepted by those inferior? When the Holy Prophet passed away, his grandson Al-Hassan was only 7 years old. So it was as if the roof of his world was ripped off with the death of his blessed grandfather. What made it worse was how Quraysh schemed against his father and how they plotted to contest him for something they had no right to. And so Amir al-Mu'mineen had to choose between responding with his hands tied behind his back or being patient and turning a blind eye, and he found that the second option was the sounder option and most rational. And so he stayed silent despite the pain he was enduring. Not long had passed before he saw the Qurayshi brutality at the door of the Holy Prophet, and in the body of Fatima Zahra, who left to the presence of her Lord Almighty, grief-stricken and heartbroken. Imam Hassan goes to the mosque of the Holy Prophet and his pulpit, only to find somebody on the pulpit who is not the Holy Prophet, nor his father. So he objects to him, saying, "Get off of my father's pulpit, and go to your father's pulpit." Al-Hassan, in the time of the 3 caliphs. Imam Hassan's stance in the time of the 3 caliphs did not differ at all from that of his father. And naturally so, for his father once described him saying, "I found you part of me, or rather, I found you entirely me," especially considering that Imam Hassan was still in his youth in the time of the first 2 caliphs, and so he followed in his father's footsteps. Amir al-Mu'mineen was never satisfied with those who came to rule, or their numerous blunders he refers to when he says, "By Allah, people have been plagued with blunders and conflicts, discoloration and controversy, but I preserved throughout the crisis. And yet he never considered the matter personal to himself. To him, the entire matter of rule and succession was less significant to him than a goat's sneeze or leftover pig meat in the hand of a leper. And yet he did what he could to make sure that society was running smoothly. He never prevented his companions from contributing with what they could to fix the dent and correct the path, whether in peace with their knowledge and wisdom, or in war with their bravery and leadership, or even in politics, running subjects and nation equally competently. But that does not mean we should accept what some historians said about Imam Hassan and Imam Hussein participating in the Islamic wars and conquests conducted by the caliphs. We have established elsewhere that there is simply no evidence that support those claims. And even further from the truth is what some so-called historians, followers of the Umayyad regime, claimed, which is that Imam Hassan was a devoted supporter of Uthman. By doing so, they hit 2 birds with 1 stone. They boost Uthman's status by claiming Al-Hassan's support for him, and at the same time, they diminish Imam Ali's status by claiming that his own son did not support his policies, finding them flawed and defective. The fact of the matter is, supporter of Uthman is a milder expression for Umayyad follower, but how could that be true about Imam Hassan, who, immediately after the martyrdom of his father, marched out to fight Muawiyah and his army, despite his army in Kufa being in a detrimental state? There will be a separate segment about his battles with the Umayyads later. However, Al-Hassan and Al-Hussein were among the people Imam Ali would send to prevent schemers from plotting against the Caliph, from assassinating him, raiding his home, and attacking his family. Here we see the moral values of the Imam, as he did not sit aside as a spectator, even though he could have, just like so many other companions did. This is despite all the terrible things Uthman did to Amir al-Mu'mineen's companions, including attacking, exiling, and defaming them, even disrespecting the Imam himself. And yet, the Imam never took advantage of the Muslims' uprising against Uthman by provoking them or such. Rather, he did what he could to mediate between them and the Caliph, fixing what could be fixed to at least ensure that Uthman's house would not be attacked. For this reason, the Imam sent his sons, Al-Hassan and Al-Hussein, to prevent that. Hence, Imam Hassan, who was around 30 years of age at the time, would follow the lead of his father, obeying his every wish and order. Al-Hassan, during the caliphate of his father, Al-Murtada, like a thirsty herd flocking a cool oasis, the people flocked around Amir al-Mu'mineen, requesting him to take the reins of the caliphate and pledging their allegiance to him. Amir al-Mu'mineen, however, was concerned that they would abandon him once they see his strict and meticulous method of following religious obligations. But the crowd that had gathered was so large that Al-Hassan and Al-Hussein were trampled, and Amir al-Mu'mineen's lips were split. Imam Hassan was his father's right-hand man, his loyal, unwavering companion. If Amir al-Mu'mineen was in an army marching to Basra, then Imam Hassan is with Ammar bin Yasir and Malik al-Ashtar and others heading to Kufa to dismiss Abu Musa al-Ash'ari from his position and preparing people to fight the treacherous enemy in the Battle of Jamal. And if Al-Hassan's position to his father in wartime was like that of a standard bearer leading the front lines, it was even said he was the one who killed the camel around which the battle revolved, then he had a leading role in peacetime as well. Witness to this is the numerous times in which Amir al-Mu'mineen would nominate him to answer questions directed towards him, such as the incident when Muawiyah was sent with several questions by the Byzantine Empire and was stumped by them. So he sent a few of his men to Kufa to ask Imam Ali these questions under the guise of being Shia, then relay those answers to him as though they were his own. Imam Ali transferred these questions to his son, Al-Hassan, and he answered them all. Even before the Battle of Jamal, Al-Hassan was his father's spokesman, his speech eloquent and elaborate, and so Abdullah bin al-Zubayri tried to stir the people against Imam Ali. The Imam sent his son Al-Hassan to speak to the people. Ibn Ahtham al-Kufi recounts in his book Al-Futuh that Abdullah bin Zubayri preached to the people of Basra, saying, Ali bin Ali Talib is the one who killed Uthman bin Affan, and he has now come to swindle you, so avenge your caliph, protect your families, and fight for your honor. When Imam Ali was informed of this speech, he said that it was I who killed Uthman bin Affan, and he claimed that I aimed to swindle you. I have been told he has even insulted me. Stand up, my son, and give the people an eloquent and brief speech, and do not insult anyone. Al-Hassan leapt up to his feet and addressed the people. He started by expressing gratitude and praise to Allah Almighty, then saying, O people, we have been informed of Abdullah bin Zubayri's statement and claims. As for the allegations that Ali killed Uthman, both the Muhajirin and Ansar know that his father, Az-Zubayri, never ceased to accuse him of the most shameful of acts. All the while, Talha bin Ubaydullah had planted his flag in front of his treasury when he was still alive. And as for his insults towards Ali, that is something we will not cease to talk about if we start, and we could if we wish so. And as for accusing Ali of deception and dishonesty, his own father, Al-Zubayri, betrayed him on the pretense that he had sworn allegiance to him only with his hand and not with his heart. Yet that is an admission that he had, in fact, paid allegiance to him. And regarding the Kufi people's confrontation of the people of Basra, that is to be expected from the people of the truth when encountering the people of falsehood. Indeed, we are not fighting the supporters of Uthman, and Ali has the right to fight the supporters of Al-Jamal wal-Salam. Following the speech, a man from Ansar stood up and started reciting poetry that roughly translates to, Benevolent Hassan, mirror of your father, you have risen among us as the greatest preacher. Ibn Ahtham reports that when the Battle of Jamal had ended, Imam Ali sent the wife of Zayd bin Suhan and the wife of Abdullah bin Abbas to Aisha, who was in Basra. They gave her a letter from Imam Ali, telling her to leave Basra and return to Medina. A few days later, he sent his son, Al-Hassan, to tell her the same, and that was the catalyst that made her hasten her return to Medina. In the Battle of Siffin, Al-Hassan and Al-Hussein were on the right flank of their father's army. They were his eyes with which he sees, and just as he protected them, they would protect him, defending him with their tremendous strength. Their fighting was so passionate and persistent that Imam Ali called to his companions, "Contain these two for me, before they end the lineage of the Holy Prophet." And yet, the two of them would immerse themselves in battle, quenching their swords in the blood of the enemies of Allah Almighty. Al-Hassan, the leader of his nation. With the martyrdom of Amir al-Mu'mineen, slain by a treacherous blow from Abd al-Rahman bin Muljam, Imam Hassan assumed the role of leadership through A. the Holy Prophet's declaration of Al-Hassan and Al-Hussein are Imams, B. Amir al-Mu'mineen's mandate of his rule, and C. the fact that he was the worthiest and highest among the Muslims of his time. With the testimony of all his father's followers in Kufa, Imam Hassan did not waste time in following his father's tactics for fighting Muawiyah, who broke the oath he made in Domat al-Jandal. After Safayan and its events, Muawiyah began sending troops to terrorize the followers of Amir al-Mu'mineen, killing and ambushing them in the corners of the Islamic Empire. In fact, Imam Ali was preparing another army to fight Muawiyah when he was martyred, and so Imam Hassan continued on that route, preparing his troops and assembling all those ready to fight in Nakhila, a military camp outside Kufa. For certain reasons and circumstances, which we will further explore when talking about the Imam's treaty and the theories behind it, a truce was formed between Muawiyah, his supporters in Syria, and Imam Hassan and Muslims in general. The most important term of this truce was that rule was to go to Muawiyah on the condition that he was to rule under the law of the Quran and the traditions of the Holy Prophet, and that he will not pursue the followers of Amir al-Mu'mineen, nor punish them for their association with him, and that the caliphate will pass to Imam Hassan after him if he is alive, and otherwise to Al-Hussein, among several other terms. The Peace Treaty. Despite the conflicting opinions on the peace treaty and its terms, it was clear that it was the best option for the Islamic nation in general, for the followers of Amir al-Mu'mineen in particular, and for Imam Hassan himself. And although it is advantageous to Muawiyah and his supporters on the short term, but on the long term, that was not the case. Realizing this caused Muawiyah to seriously consider eliminating Imam Hassan entirely and assassinating him. Although Muawiyah was in no way an expert in combat, nor was he brave enough for direct confrontation, he was a specialist when it came to murder, treachery, and poisoning, something he had done numerous times with enemies, rivals, and even his own friends. So what stops him from doing so with Imam Hassan? Religious obligations? A moral pledge? An oath or promise? All of these mean nothing to the likes of Muawiyah. And that is what happened. The assassination was carried out by Ja'da, the daughter of Al-Ash'af bin Qais al-Kindi. She was the wife of Imam Hassan before poisoning him in return for becoming Yazid's wife. And so, after being goaded by these criminals, this double-crossed woman poisoned the Imam in Safar, 50 Hijri, which ultimately ended with his martyrdom. Did Imam Hassan take part in the Caliph's conquests? It seems that the first to talk about this was Muhammad bin Jarir al-Tabri, Muhammad bin Jarir الطبري Muhammad bin Jarir الطبري. In historical recount, he says, Umar bin Shabba has informed me that he was told by Ali bin Mujahid, that Habash bin Malik said Sa'id bin al-As set off from Kufa on conquest for 30 years, heading for Khurasan. Accompanying him was Hudhayfa bin al-Yaman and several of the Holy Prophet's companions, along with Al-Hassan, Al-Hussein, Abdullah bin al-As, Abdullah bin Umar, Abdullah bin Amr bin al-As, Abdullah bin Zubayri. Several other Sunni historians after him also said the same thing. First of all, should this be true, we do not find it problematic nor contradictory to our beliefs. Some argue that this cannot be true because the leader of the army, Sa'id bin al-As, and how can Al-Hassan and Al-Hussein be subordinate to the likes of him, or that the conquests were not conducted in a strictly speaking honorable way, at least in their beginnings. The first argument can be answered by the fact that, if it did happen, then it was with the approval of Amir al-Mu'mineen, who is the Imam of their time, therefore justified and authorized, and was simply a case of prioritizing one thing over another. The second issue can be refuted through arguing that their presence in the army, if proven, was for the purpose of regulating and amending the methods of conquest as much as possible. This is how the participation of some of Amir al-Mu'mineen's followers in the conquest was justified, especially those who are least likely to do something out of their own accord and without the approval of their Imam. And there was quite a few of them. And so, when presented with two choices, complete corruption or regulation as much as possible, the second choice was the wiser option. This is especially considering that the conquests were not purely evil. Rather, they spread the word of Islam to distant communities, and despite being interlaced with material gains and riddled with mistakes and transgressions. We do not find a problem with this claim, should it indeed be proven to be true. The problem, however, is that it is not supported by any evidence. In fact, there is evidence to the contrary, such as Ibn al-Athir in his book Al-Kamil refers to a dispute revolving around the conquest of Tabaristan, and whether it took place in 18 Hijri in the time of Umar bin al-Khattab, or whether it was in 30 Hijri during the time of Uthman bin Affan. The same report also mentions that the army sent to Tabaristan came from Kufa. We know that Imam Hassan was in Medina in 30 Hijri and did not move to Kufa until 36 Hijri, when he relocated there with his father after returning from the Battle of Jamal. Before that, there is no report that Imam Hassan ever went to Kufa. The relations between the Hashemites and Uthman bin Affan in these times were turbulent at best, clashing at worst. This year, the people of Kufa testified against Al-Walid al-Uqba, Uthman's half-brother from his mother, and his alcohol addiction. They took the matter to the Caliph, but he refused to punish him adequately despite the witnesses' testimonies, and so Imam Ali took matters into his own hands. He, or one of his household, punished Al-Walid by flogging, despite Uthman's disapproval. Also, in this year, Abu Dharr al-Ghafari was exiled to Rabda by the order of Uthman. When he passed away there, Imam Ali, Al-Hassan, Al-Hussein, and some of his followers attended his funeral, even though the Caliph prohibited it. These times of high tension between the government and Amir al-Mu'mineen meant that it was very unlikely that he would send his sons to fight in these conquests. It was him who said in the Battle of Jamal, "Contain these two for me, before they end the lineage of the Holy Prophet." And that battle was for the righteous purpose and justified means, and under the flag of an infallible Imam. And yet, he was still worried they would be killed, and the lineage of the Holy Prophet would be terminated. It is likely that the Imam would allow his sons to leave and fight under the command of Sa'id bin al-As, who was among those the Holy Prophet was talking about when he said, "When the progeny of al-As reached 30 men, They will seize the wealth of Allah as personal earnings, and His servants as slaves. What with this being the time in which the Caliph began blatantly colliding with the Imam. We also see Uthman complaining about Abdullah bin Abbas to his father, Al-Abbas bin Abdul Muttalib, accusing him of riling up his enemies, and even conspiring against him. So how, in these circumstances, would he then go and fight in his conquest under his generals? The aforementioned excerpt said that among the men who went on the conquest of Tabaristan was Abdullah bin Abbas. A number of those in Ibn al-Athir's chain of narrators has been described as liars, fabricators, and fraudsters, as we mentioned previously in the footnotes. We also do not find this recount in any earlier sources, even though there is a good number for this information to be mentioned, if it were true. After all, it is very important to the Sunni faith for them to prove that there is a good relationship and correlation between Imam Hadi and the caliphs in order to establish the legitimacy of their rule, to show that everybody was content with the way things were. And what better evidence that the participation of Al-Hassan and Al-Hussein in the caliph's conquests, and yet this claim has not been made except by At-Tabari. We also do not find it in any biographies or hadith books, Sunni or Shia, that talk about the lives of either Imam. We know that our books follow every stage and period of their lives, so how can an event so important not be mentioned at all, not even with a single line in any hadith, biographical or historical source? Stranger than that is what is mentioned by Abdul Rahman bin Khalidun, who isn't unknown to have odd reports, where he narrates that when Uthman bin Affan wanted to conquer Africa, he assigned Abdullah bin Sa'ad bin Abi Sarah as the commander of the army, setting out in 25 Hijri. He says, then Abdullah bin Abi Sarah asked for Uthman's approval, asked for Uthman's approval and backing. Uthman took counseling from the Sahaba. Uthman took counseling from the Sahaba. Uthman took counseling from the Sahaba. Uthman took counseling from the Sahaba, who gave him their advice. He prepared the army in Medina, and among the troops were Ibn Abbas, Ibn Umar, Ibn Amr bin al-As, Ibn Ja'far, Al-Hassan, Al-Hussein, and Ibn Azuwairi, and they all set out with Abdullah bin Abi Sarah, almost as if Al-Hassan and Al-Hussein had nothing better to do than wait for any random commander Uthman assigns, rush to his side, and march with him to the ends of the earth. However, Ibn Khalidun, the same person who, in the introduction of his book, ranted about all the historians who come up with things that have no source, no backing, and no proof, did not himself provide any sources for this. In fact, Ibn al-Athir, who came before him and wrote Al-Kamil fil Tarikh, did mention Uthman assigning Abdullah bin Abi Sarah, but he did not say that he took Al-Hassan and Al-Hussein, and neither did Al-Mas'udi in Maruj al-Dhahab, nor did At-Tabari say so in his history book. All he said was that Uthman encouraged the people to participate in the conquest of Africa, and 10,000 men gathered from Quraysh, the Muhajirin, and Ansar, even though it was him who said what he said about the conquest of Tabaristan, and we have already disproven that. So either Ibn Khalidun made a mistake and said what Tabari said, just in Africa instead of Tabaristan, even though he actually said it in both sections, which would be a dreadful form of negligence and a lack of accuracy, and he purposefully added that himself, which is even more shameful and unforgivable.